Okay, welcome to the Lyceum and to the fall session of our 2024 IForum series, Building Momentum for Housing Supply Reforms. Many of you that I see joined us earlier in the year as we explored the critical role for state-funded voucher programs and the role that they play in affordability here in Connecticut and in our neighboring states. And today we're talking about housing supply. We're really excited to delve into the challenges and the opportunities here in Connecticut, drawing from successes in our neighboring states. We'll explore policy solutions and the strategies that can break through political barriers and propel Connecticut to the forefront of housing development and meeting the housing needs of our residents. I'm Chelsea Ross. I serve as the Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. We're so pleased to have you here with us today. If you haven't been to the Lyceum before, there are restrooms up the stage on the right there. There's also a restroom in the back right of the hall. I think most of you found the coffee earlier, but feel free to take a break and grab coffee at any time. I always tell folks that even though there's glass panels, the ceiling is kind of open. So if you step out to have a phone conversation in that room, we will hear you. So you might want to head back downstairs for that. And a note that we will be recording our session today. Thank you, Don. So we'll make that recording available on our YouTube page if you need to revisit any of the content because it was so riveting, or you have a colleague that you'd like to share with. Okay, so at the partnership, if you don't know us, we've spent 25 years shaping housing solutions in Connecticut. Our guiding principle is that housing is a human right. We envision a future where everyone in Connecticut has a safe, stable home that's affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice. Together, we are here for housing. We work to impact change for individuals and families across the housing stability continuum. No one in Connecticut should experience being unhoused or unstably housed or living in temporary, unaffordable, or unsafe housing conditions. Everyone should have access to a home that they can afford in a safe, healthy environment in a strong and thriving community. So how do we realize this vision? A healthy housing system necessitates a comprehensive approach that integrates affordability, creation, choice, and stability. Everyone deserves a home without sacrificing their basic needs. We must expand the supply of homes in our state, plain and simple, and ensure a variety of housing options exist in all of our communities. People deserve protection from instability, eviction, and homelessness, and this is how we build a system that truly reflects the needs of our children, our families, and our communities. We're delighted to start today welcoming Charles Gardner from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University to explore successful housing supply reforms from across the U.S. Charles will highlight a variety of approaches states have taken to address zoning, land use, and affordability challenges, and offer some insight into which strategies might be most effective here in Connecticut. Next, we have the distinct honor of welcoming State Representative and House Majority Leader Jason Rojas, as well as State Representative and my representative, Lenny Cavros-DeGraw, who Jason talked into doing this about 5 minutes ago. So give her a lot of grace. To talk about reform efforts in the upcoming 2025 legislative session. And we'll hear from Representative Rojas and Representative Cavros-DeGraw on their vision, and we'll have some opportunity to ask them some questions. We'll round out our morning welcoming Matt Noyes, Director of Public Policy at the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, commonly known as CHAPA, in our neighboring state of Massachusetts. Matt will talk about the recent passage of the landmark Affordable Homes Act, how it puts Massachusetts on the path to adding 200,000 new homes across income levels, and the efforts and leadership that went into passing and now implementing this historic piece of legislation. We've reserved some time for Q&A after each of our presenters. There were some note cards downstairs, so we'll collect those after each presenter. If you have a question for Charlie, a question for our legislative leaders, or for Matt. I think Sean and Kayla are in the back, and they'll come around and collect those for you. And in addition to the opportunity to join the conversation here in the room, we also invite you always to join us on social at #IForum24 across all of our social platforms. And the fun doesn't stop today. So if you've been living under a rock, and you haven't heard that we are hosting our 5th annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. I know you're all tied to our email list and newsletter and read all of them, but you'll have the experience in November to have more than 24 virtual keynote, plenary, and breakout sessions across 2 days next month, November 18th and 19th. On Monday, November 18th, we'll welcome Jerusalem Demsis, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic and author of On the Housing Crisis, followed by a legislative roundtable. You can't pass up on the opportunity to hear from Representative Rojas and Representative Cavros-DeGraw again. Then we'll have an afternoon packed with interesting breakout sessions. The next day on Tuesday, we'll start the day with Brian McCabe and Eva Rosen, both professors at Georgetown University and co-editors of the recently released Sociology of Housing, followed by a roundtable of Connecticut mayors who are working to transform underutilized land and commercial spaces in their towns to meet local housing needs. We'll have another afternoon of breakout sessions and an in-person reception right here at the Lyceum in the evening, where we'll celebrate and honor our 2024 Here for Housing ambassadors. So there's truly something for everyone, so we're excited to see you again next month. Lastly, I have a couple of thank yous before I turn it over to Charlie. I want to acknowledge the team here at the partnership that put this forum on together. So Alicia Gardner, who's not here, has a sick baby, but we're very appreciative of all the work that she did. Danielle Hubley, who's right there in the front. Sean and Michelle Montano, who you probably saw downstairs bopping around. Give them a quick round of applause because they did a lot of work here. We have a really fantastic team of practitioners here at the partnership who are really dedicated to our mission to promote equitable change in housing policy across the state through advocacy, research, and convening. So we have the best team here. I also want to thank each of you for being here today, spending your bright and early Monday morning here at the Lyceum. And those of you who made a donation with your registration for the event, we really appreciate that. It's important to us to keep our all of our educational opportunities free and accessible to everyone. So thank you for those of you who did that. And a thank you to Bank of America, who's sponsoring this series and allowing us to keep it free. Both Joe and Jill from Bank of America are out of town. They were supposed to join us and they had an event come up, and so they shared some brief remarks that I'm going to read on behalf of Bank of America. So on behalf of our 2,500 teammates in Connecticut, we're pleased to support the partnership and sponsor the IForum series. At Bank of America, we look to deploy our capital and grants to help build strong, sustainable communities. This includes our efforts to help address the affordable housing shortage in communities across the country, and we are also focused on helping make homeownership more affordable right here in Connecticut. Why? To increase economic mobility in the communities we serve. How? Through our business, partnerships, and communities. They've provided nearly $8 billion in debt and equity financing and other real estate development solutions, and deployed $4.1 billion in debt commitments and $2.5 billion in investments. And over the last 15 years, Bank of America has financed more than 263,000 housing units, of which 86% are affordable. So Bank of America wants to thank all of you for your efforts and taking the time this morning to investigate housing supply reform. It's going to take all of us to impact change. Okay, so with that, I'd like to welcome our first presenter to the stage. Welcome Charles Gardner. Charles is a research fellow at the Mercatus Center. His research focuses on planning law and housing affordability. He frequently advises local government officials on zoning matters. He's an active participant in state policymaking on the Connecticut Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and on the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that introduction. Also, thank you to Sean and Partnership for Strong Communities for inviting me and for hosting this event in this beautiful historic building, which I've never been to before. It's actually nice. I've had several people very kindly welcome me to Connecticut this morning. Thanks for coming up. But I actually live in Newtown, just down the road. So only about an hour, fortunately, not all the way from Arlington, Virginia, which is where the Mercatus Center is based. Mercatus Center, if you don't know, focuses a lot on free market reforms to all areas of the economy, but where I work is in particular on the housing and zoning side, and particularly looking at what I'm going to talk about a little bit here today is on state level zoning and land use reforms, which is something where we've seen a ton of activity over the last 2 years in particular. It's really ramped up, I think partially in response to the housing crisis and housing prices spiraling out of control to the point where state legislators can no longer ignore the issue and have finally been forced to take action where cities have not been. So very briefly, I'm just going to do just a little bit of review. This may be very familiar to a lot of the people here. If it's not, then hopefully you'll learn a little bit of something. But very brief history of state involvement. How did the states get involved in the first place? Just as a little bit of background to where we are today in 2024. So in the 1920s, the Federal Department of Commerce issued the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. You can still look it up. It's if you Google it, you can pull it up. It's a short document. You can read it. It sets everything out. And did what I call sort of handing the keys to the car to the localities. It gave them a blank check to regulate land use more or less however they want, without any sort of guardrails, no substantive guardrails, no limitations on their power. There was some question as to whether the use of that power in that way was constitutional, but that was largely resolved in the 1920s with the Euclid versus Ambler decision. There was finally a reaction to this use of localities essentially to exclude affordable housing and to use the zoning power as an exclusionary mechanism in the 1970s and 1980s in Massachusetts and here in Connecticut. Massachusetts with Chapter 40B, and as Connecticut, you're probably all familiar with Section 830G, which was a response to what became obvious that localities were abusing their power to keep out lower income housing, affordable housing. From 2016 to the present, what we've seen is what I'm characterizing as a new era of market-based state reforms, which really began in California with accessory dwelling unit laws right around 2016, and since then has sort of grown and expanded. But California was, I think, ground zero for the housing affordability crisis. Even before COVID, their home prices were becoming far out of reach of most people's ability to pay. So that was really where this whole trend started. So why should states get involved, right? You've probably always heard, well, zoning, we need to preserve local control. Zoning belongs to the towns. The state shouldn't interfere. The localities know best. The state legislators up in Hartford or whatever state capital, what do they know about our local particularities and the local issues? Shouldn't we just leave that to the local planning and zoning commissions? Well, the awareness, especially in the last 10 years, of exclusionary zoning, of how localities use their zoning powers in ways which makes it difficult for people to attain affordable housing that's within a reasonable amount of their income has grown, thanks to books, thanks to scholarship, thanks to new economic research. There have been a whole lot of new books just published over the last 10 years which have been focused on this issue, some of which you've probably read, anywhere from The Color of Law by Richard Ralston. You may have seen that one, showing the history of how some of these exclusionary mechanisms developed over the years, as well as market-focused critiques. Also, the housing crisis obviously has become a nationwide phenomenon. Anybody who's been house hunting in Connecticut over the last 2 or 3 years you can probably recognize inventory is very low for those houses that do come on the market. There's a bidding war. Rents have risen rapidly, and there's simply not that many available. And finally, with localities being perceived as slow to act, I think states have been willing to reach back and essentially claw back some of that authority they gave to localities in the 1920s, and have realized, you know what, we gave that authority, but we always reserve the authority to take it back, or at least limit it in some way for the public welfare. The picture I have here, I don't know, does anybody recognize what station this is? It's in Fairfield County. This is Metro North Line. It's actually the Rowayton station, if you recognize it. So this is just an example of how localities using zoning in a transit accessible location, despite this being a direct rail line into New York City, this is surrounded by zoning, which the city characterizes as suburban medium lot community district to the north with minimum lot sizes of 12,500 square feet. It's called primarily a low-density, single-family, detached residential area with medium to deep setbacks, and this is right next to the train station. So I think highlights, this would be an ideal opportunity, ideal location for potentially higher density, and yet even after Norwalk zoning reforms, there's still low-density housing right next to the station. Okay, so let's step back to a broader national perspective and see what's happened over the last couple of years. Just to give you a few statistics, a few overall statistics, in the first 6 months of 2024, states, this is looking at all 50 states, enacted 50 housing supply bills, and that's compared with only 30 enacted during the same months in 2023. In the past year or so, 65 housing supply bills have been enacted in 20 states. Several states that had major housing supply bills continue to advance legislation. California, Florida, and Rhode Island have all passed ambitious housing packages. I think Rhode Island should be of particular interest to Connecticut. Colorado and Arizona were comeback stories. They had major housing packages fail in 2023 and came back to pass legislation this past year, showing that if at first you don't succeed, keep trying. The persistence in approach has actually proven successful in some of these states. Hawaii and Maryland have gotten into the state level legislation game on housing supply. Hawaii, kind of an unusual example, but honestly, they face some of the highest housing prices relative to incomes of any state in the country, and we're in desperate need of more housing. Any new trends this year? Yes. Building code reforms. In past years, we've been mainly looking at accessory dwelling units, reforming lot sizes, the actual substance of the zoning code. But this year, 5 states took steps toward allowing what's known as single-stair multifamily building designs, including our own state of Connecticut, which has a proposal to study the feasibility of single-stair multifamily building designs. Essentially, that's allowing one staircase in an apartment building rather than 2, which is the type you see in your typical hotel, where you have a long hallway separating the 2 staircases, and all the rooms have to just face on the outside with one wall of windows. If you allow one staircase, you can get much more light into the apartments and get better floor plans. It seems like a little technicality, but it actually makes a big difference for infill. A few states went in the opposite direction. Vermont and Kentucky reversed some housing supply reforms, but I think in general, we've seen about 5 steps forward and 1 step back over the last 2 years, and the pace of reform seems to be accelerating. I should also mention, as you can see, that the western states are really lit up more brightly here, or lit up in these darker colors. I don't know if there's anything necessarily we can read into that, but they have had some of the most acute housing crises. I mean, even Montana, you would think, well, how can Montana have a housing crisis, right? I mean, do they not have enough land out there? It seems ridiculous. But the housing prices in some of their cities, Missoula and Bozeman, are incredibly high relative to incomes. They have one of the worst affordability crises of any state in the country. So seeing reforms passed there is in part in response to that. So what types of reforms have we seen? I'm just going to run through a list here fairly quickly. Dimensional restrictions, right? Everybody's familiar with minimum lot sizes. That hasn't had a whole lot of success at the state level, but it has just a little diversion here in terms of talking about cities that have advanced this agenda. Austin, Spokane, and Gainesville actually just about 2 weeks ago passed minimum lot size reform, showing that where states can't do this, actually some cities that have the leadership have been able to do this. Other reforms, maximum height setbacks from streets, forbidding aesthetic requirements. Not a whole lot of activity this year, but Iowa and Rhode Island did pass some modest reforms on dimensional changes, although typically this has been a fairly heavy lift at legislatures. Picture getting cut off? Might be. Parking minimums. This is actually one of the most consequential reforms that I think any state can do. It's particularly expensive for multifamily. The parking mandates that often require, sometimes one, sometimes two parking spaces per unit. Oftentimes a lot of this parking gets unused. So this year, California, Colorado, Maryland, New Hampshire, and Washington all either eliminated parking requirements or greatly restricted them, sometimes just capping them to just one space per residential unit. Again, seems like a fairly technical reform, but it can make a huge difference in terms of how projects actually pencil out. The building code, not zoning, right? But it does affect what can be built. I mentioned single stair reforms. Also, there's a really very new focus on cheaper elevators. American elevator requirements are much more onerous than they are in almost anywhere else in the world. It's something that's only recently come to broader attention. But it can make a big difference, not just in terms of the cost of units, but also accessibility. If elevators are so expensive to build that developers don't want to put them into buildings, low-rise buildings, which are not required to for shorter buildings, then you're going to have issues with general accessibility of the higher up units. So it's both a cost and accessibility concern. So this year, California, Connecticut, Minnesota, Tennessee, and Virginia all took action in this area. So we may be seeing this emerging trend towards single stair buildings. Elevator reform is still in its infancy. People are trying to understand how we've inadvertently hobbled ourselves with our elevator regulations. And adding more density. So rather than changing minimum lot sizes, this other approach is simply allowing more units within existing lots. So, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, two different approaches. Townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, just basically, you could say, allowing more than one stove in the same building. It's all kind of arbitrary, right? You can't see from the outside how many units are in a building necessarily. If you walk around here in Hartford, some of the apartment buildings, you could take a guess. Maybe there's 4, maybe there's 6, maybe there's 2. You could count the mailboxes or count the doorbells, but otherwise you really wouldn't have any way of knowing unless you investigated further. But this addresses that and says, we're not going to restrict how many units you can put within whatever building you have there. So this has been, in past years, this has been quite a popular reform. Arizona, Maryland, and Washington just in this past year. And I think it's one that is particularly amenable to New England states, which are familiar with small multifamily typologies. In Hartford we have a historic legacy of 6-unit apartment buildings, which you see all over the place, triplexes, duplexes, also in Bridgeport, Stamford, New Haven. These building types are all over the place. People are familiar with them. There's probably a good likelihood that anybody in this room at some point in your life, you may have lived in one of those and realized they're not so scary or terrifying. In fact, they actually provide a nice place to live, usually a good location in a city. So it's definitely not a foreign concept. I think myself, I've lived in within Connecticut, within a 6-plex and a 3-decker, and it was just fine. It wasn't so terrifying that everybody seemed to get together in the neighborhood. The housing types mixed together, and it worked all right. So I think most people will be able to identify with that sort of reform in New England states. Opening up new zones to housing. This is also a particular trend that's arisen since COVID. With the increase in the number of people working from home, there have been a lot of vacancies in commercial spaces, but existing zoning often actually prohibits residential in those commercial zones, essentially just trying to reserve it for office space, to have a single-use business district. So states have been responding by forbidding localities from excluding residential from commercial zones. So you're no longer able to exclude residential, which is not a harmful use, not an unsafe use, obviously, from areas which are zoned for commercial or for offices. And this has been relatively uncontroversial, I think particularly so because it doesn't affect any of the areas zoned single-family residential where a lot of the controversy arises. It's only in areas where typically nobody lives to object. So it's been politically somewhat easier. Also, faith, nonprofit lands, faith also known as Yes in God's Backyard. I don't know if anybody's heard that, allowing religious institutions more control over what they can build on their land. Oftentimes, houses of worship have significant land holdings, but they really can't do much of anything with it, even if they want to dispose of it. Laws that allow them to develop it for residential, whether it's affordable or market rate. Florida's Live Local Act, I don't know if people are familiar with that. It's vaguely similar to 830G, except the income requirements, the deed restricted requirements are somewhat lower in terms of income. It's easier to, essentially it's easier easier to qualify, and it covers a larger range of incomes, which has been successful in producing a ton of housing in the few years it's been in effect. The downsides here, yes, some of these rules, some of these laws have tended to be vague. There's a risk that in commercial zones you're directing residential into areas that may be higher traffic, near highways, near industrial uses. But overall, I think it's been a positive trend. Arizona, California, Florida, Hawaii, and Maryland have all done this. This is just in the past year. Accessory dwelling units. This may be the most familiar one to people from Connecticut because we actually do have a state law in the books as of a few years ago, 2 years ago or so, the opt-in law requiring towns, unless they opted out, to provide for accessory dwelling units. So just this year, we added 5 states to the list. There are many other ones that already have this. So it tends to be quite popular because it's seen as, I think, being focused on the individual homeowner. The individual homeowner has the option to build it. It's not seen as being a developer-friendly zoning change. And in some states, especially in Southern California, it's been very successful in producing housing at scale. Los Angeles and San Diego have produced tens of thousands of so-called accessory dwelling units. Really just, they're units, they're homes. They're called accessory, but essentially they're simply just a housing unit like any other, just on the same lot. They have, in some cases, been proven to be effective at actually addressing the housing shortage if the regulations are written correctly. Could they have the same role in Connecticut? I think to date, and maybe it's too early to tell with the laws we currently have, but there are always ways to strengthen these regulations, I think, make them better, make them easier, make them more by right, and these changes actually make quite a difference in terms of your outcomes. Just looking at some of the details on ADUs, because really for ADU laws, the devil is in the details. It's easy to get poison pills put in there that makes them almost impossible to build. And say we allow ADUs, but you have to have 4 parking spaces per unit, or we allow ADUs, but they can't be more than 500 square feet, or we allow ADUs, but the owner has to live in the main unit. And as soon as you move out, you lose your right to live in it. All these things which basically make it infeasible to build, or would make it very, very unlikely that somebody would consider it a good economic proposition to build. So this just gives you a sense of some of the states that have passed these regulations. What sorts of restrictions are there that have made them more or less feasible in terms of being built? I think owner occupancy restrictions are particularly onerous. Parking requirements as well use up a lot of space. And also simply being permitted by right, not having to go for a special exception, or in which case you're going to have to sit through a public hearing, maybe alert your neighbors, and you're going to be just simply to build an ADU on the back of your property, which I don't think any individual homeowner would particularly look forward to that. Typically, you're not going to have a whole lot of people showing up to cheer you on. They're probably going to be there to complain about it. And they will be your neighbors and maybe some of your friends, and it will all be pretty unpleasant and uncomfortable. Being by right is ministerial. It means it goes directly through the building department. No need for a hearing. You can build it just like any other single-family unit. So I think that's particularly important. Also, detached units. If an ADU can be built separately, it's simply like having two units on the same lot. And in some cases, in some states, California has just started with this, is exploring allowing ADUs to be sold separately, rather than this conception of ADUs just being a rental that's subservient to the main unit. You can have an ADU that's just its own house and can be sold separately. Reforms to the permitting process. This is about speeding up the process of approval. Also, can be somewhat easier because it's it doesn't involve the substance of zoning. It's about lowering costs, speeding up time frames, reducing uncertainty. So a lot of states have gotten on board with this. This is especially helpful for smaller developers who don't have the time or the resources to go through a long, protracted process where they keep getting asked to bring in more experts and do this and that, and having public hearings continued over and over and over again over months and months and months. It's all about streamlining that process and making it easier and more predictable. Fair share requirements, that's been discussed here in Connecticut, but this is just an overall better planning. Saying rather than interfering with the small details, we're just going to set an overall state housing goals for each town, and then each town you go figure out how you want to do that, but we're going to make sure that you're providing enough. We're more concerned about the number than about how you get there, essentially. So you might be thinking, what approach works best here? What is most effective? It's kind of a tough question. It's like, do we look at outcomes? But a lot of that depends upon the exact details of the policy, and you really have to scrutinize the laws to see what's working. Big bills that have tried to do everything at once, though, and everything to all people, Colorado, New York last year, were very unsuccessful and did not get far despite having gubernatorial backing in both of those states. Whereas in Montana, where there were a lot of smaller bills, their housing reform was successful. That was the similar situation in Rhode Island, where their housing reforms were a package of less ambitious bills rather than one omnibus bill that tried to do everything. In terms of actual effectiveness, Florida's Live Local law is probably up there. The way California has written its ADU laws is up there. And I think missing middle as well, to the extent we can really simplify it, streamline it, and actually give it an ownership option rather than seeing the ADU as just this secondary building sitting in the backyard that's reserved as a rental, which is the way we've conceptualized it, and maybe thinking beyond that to what else an ADU can be. If you have any questions, please do email me. You can follow me on Twitter or X. I guess I still have listed as Twitter. But if you have any questions, or does anybody have any questions now? Are we good?
Kayla and Sean are here to grab questions from you on your note cards. If you have them for Charlie, just wave them up. I see Tim back there. And Sean, I think you have a mic if you want to read it out to Charlie. I have questions for you, but I'll go after the audience.
Yep. Thank you. Any others? Tim, you win. Right off the bat, I can't read your writing. So. Tim, why don't you ask your question? I can't quite make it.
Okay. Good morning, Charlie. First, excellent national summary. Thank you for that. You didn't mention what might be the elephant in the room, which is inclusionary zoning. Your thoughts on that? Is it a two-edged sword or something you recommend? Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Sure, thank you for the question, Tim. Yes, inclusionary zoning, I think, again, it all depends upon the details. Florida's Live Local Act is a sort of a light touch inclusionary zoning bill where the deed restricted housing has been set at a level that's pretty close to, or the income requirement is pretty close to the median income for Floridians. And that has been very successful. That hasn't limited construction, but it's also produced a lot of market rate housing that is feasible to the average Floridian. So in that case, it seems like a success. In other cases, like you've seen in some of the Pacific Northwest states, so Oregon and Washington, Seattle, what happens is you see what appears to be well-intentioned legislation asking developers to say, well, you can set aside 20, 30, 40% of the housing for people at 30% of AMA. Sounds like, oh, that's great. It sounds progressive, but what happens is it causes the projects to fail to pencil out completely. And we've seen a couple instances where after inclusionary zoning has been passed in Minnesota and Seattle, new multifamily permits actually dropped substantially. And there was a reduction in the total amount of housing being produced. And this was presumably done out of pure motives, but where the restrictions are onerous, it can have that unintended consequence of cratering production. So for that reason, I can't support it as a general matter, but in some cases, I think where it's fine-tuned and has the right balance, it has done some good as a builder's remedy like 830G is, not as a bottom line requirement. I think that's the other thing I would say, not as a mandate for all projects, but as an option, whether it's a density bonus or whether you get some other benefit from opting into it as an alternative to the baseline zoning. But that would be my sort of caveat there. Yeah.
I have a couple other questions back here, so I'll read them out. Kind of related, are there examples of incentive-based fair share? In other words, do any other states allow infrastructure or education funding based on growth plans?
California has something like that, although they tend to take a more of an adversarial approach, an enforcement approach rather than a carrot approach. But overall, I think fair share is still a concept that's in its infancy for many states. And the exact way to do that is still up in the air. I don't know if you followed California, but there have been lawsuits flying back and forth between the state attorney general and various localities for failing to live up to the standards. And then if you fail to conform, if you fail to meet your what's called a regional housing needs allocation, then essentially the builder's remedy kicks in. So that's the penalty. If you don't meet your planning goals, then your entire local zoning essentially is abated for a while, and builders can do whatever they want, which is sort of a powerful incentive. But I think in Connecticut, for example, what you often hear is some of the smaller towns saying, well, that's great, we'd be happy to build some more, but we don't have the infrastructure, right? We don't have a sewer system, we don't have a water system, our roads aren't up to par, our topography isn't right, we have too many wetlands, and we don't have the local planning capacity to accommodate this kind of growth. So I think for the New England states example, where you have particularly small municipalities, in some other states you have larger, better funded counties that have larger planning departments. A lot of Connecticut's towns are so small, they often don't have a planner, a full-time planner on staff. They don't have that capacity. So I think for Connecticut at least, that would be an important component of a fair share scheme. Yeah, that's a really good question.
And you touched a little bit on infrastructure, and we have a couple of questions related to that as well, so I'll read one now. Some towns may actually be open to increased density, but in towns with limited sewers, the WPCAs can prevent greater density by denying connections to the sewer system. How might towns challenge this obstacle?
How might towns that want to build more?
Yeah, but that their water companies, sewer organizations might deny connections to the system. How might towns or developers work around that?
Yeah. People are familiar with the term sewer avoidance, and certainly in Newtown, where I am, that's part of the official town policy, which is avoiding extending sewers. And I think Attorney Holster knows exactly what I'm talking about. which is kind of a bit of a cynical policy, especially from an environmental point of view, that you don't want to extend the sewers into areas where currently effluent is leaching into the soil. So I think it takes a rethinking at a local level of what the sewer system is for, dispensing with this fiction that it's simply there as an environmental mitigation measure and should be used as an economic development measure, as an affordable housing measure. So it's really a political question about what it's to be used for. You see people, when the sewer system was put in Newtown after basically a 30-year fight with the state, people were calling it, it's the end of the town. This is going to be an absolute disaster. Now people can build more densely, which, hasn't really happened. But it is something I think that has to be debated politically, and there is, I think the legislature has acknowledged that by starting to introduce bills that provide incentives for towns to use their sewer systems for good rather than to live in terror of them as some harbinger of density. But it is, I think, changing the conversation both from the bottom up and from the top down as to how people think about these sewers. And by the way, Attorney Hollister, I think I tweeted it out, has a whole paper that he wrote on sewer politics in Connecticut, which is very informative. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest you look that up and read it, because that gives you a whole background of this issue, a lot of the details, some war stories that he has. It's really interesting. So Google it up and see if you can find it. At least it was available online last time I looked, but really good background on that.
I think that concludes our questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I think too, Charlie will make these available. It has some further reading in addition to Tim's recommended reading, and also Attorney Hollister's 5-part series that was just in the Mirror is also essential reading. I'm seeing a lot of heads nod there. All right, so now we're right on time. We're going to shift our focus to what's happening here on the ground in Connecticut. Charlie gave us a great overview of what we've seen in some of our states. So please join me in welcoming Representative Rojas and Representative Cavros-DeGraw to the stage. Right on. And just as a reminder, you can write down questions for our representatives on note cards, and Kayla and Sean will collect them again. We appreciate your doing that so we can keep on time. We're trying to keep our morning tight. Everybody's got places to be, things to do, so really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Cavros-DeGraw and Representative Rojas. I'll start with you, Rep. Rojas. As in your position as Majority Leader, you are the Connecticut General Assembly's leading voice on housing affordability. Tell us why this issue is so important to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, and thank you everybody for being here, and for my colleague Eleni getting pulled up on stage with very little notice, but that's what happens. I figured she does chair the Planning and Development Committee, great voice on housing as well in the legislature, so why not have an additional voice rather than just listening to me? But yeah, I've long been, I come to the issue of housing largely from the lens of housing segregation, racial and economic segregation. It's what drives me kind of morally into the issue. And then of course, housing is at the core of stability in all sorts of ways, right? Stability for the family, stability for communities, and certainly stability for the state of Connecticut. And when we talk about affordability, I've been talking about this issue for 10 years now. Affordability wasn't a question 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3 years ago. And here we are in the last couple of years where it's become a particular issue for a lot of people. And I know Eleni can speak to it too. We hear it on the campaign trail. We get emails from our constituents. People ping me on social media about their rent, about, it often gets framed in the context of property taxes, but that also impacts affordability as well too. So it's really, I think, central to so many other inequities that we see in society, whether it has to do with health, and I see some healthcare professionals here, whether it has to do with perceptions of safety or actual safety, whether it has to do with access to opportunity and access to jobs. It has environmental impacts. So I kind of it's an all-in approach on why I think the question of housing and housing affordability is so central to my policy interests.
How about you, Rep. Cavros-DeGraw?
All of the above, but I would also, because as many of you know, we are on the campaign trail. I hear significantly in my district from seniors and people with adult children who have disabilities, and often, that group is certainly left out when we're having these conversations. So that's part of what drives me. I would also say that while we don't have the largest percentage of homelessness in Connecticut compared to other larger states, we are still meeting a number that we should not be at in this state. And as many of you know, we are not, because we don't have enough housing to transition to, people are staying in those shelters longer. They are employed, but in the shelter, which I think many people are not aware of. And I try to say it as loudly and as often as possible because I was actually told that because I represent Avon and Canton that, my constituents don't care about homelessness. And I will tell you that I hear about it every single day when I am out knocking doors, is that people really do actually care, even if it's not affecting them. And I think that part of our challenge as legislators is that we often only hear one set of voices that is really, really loud, and we have an acronym for them, of course, but I'm more interested in hearing from the people who do not have a voice and more interested in hearing from the people who may not be emailing us every 5 minutes to tell us what we're doing wrong, but we need to hear from them to hear their thoughts on how we can do better. And I think that as we, part of this challenge for us is doing the right thing and saying that there is a morality behind this. And when we were sitting down there together and talking about just even the townhouses on the screen, personally, I had a single mom. If it had not been for townhouses in Northern Virginia, we would not have moved out of our temporary living situation that we'd been in for 8 years with my grandparents. So I think that it's really important that we think about all the demographics, because I would posit that it is literally anyone you can think of that their stability is dependent on whether or not they have a roof over their head.
So we heard a lot of reforms that are happening around the country. What do you think is Connecticut's biggest challenge right now around affordability?
Oh, geez. I think it comes down to the biggest challenge we face is just the kind of inertia that we kind of exist in. And, I know somebody's here, Jenny's here, Jackie's here. They've quoted me on, the painfully incremental approach that we take. And I don't know that it's necessarily unique to Connecticut, but certainly in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of states advance a lot more policy on this issue, and we continue to chip away at it. And I recognize that's the political reality that we have to deal with. I'm not happy about it. I'm not content with it. But as the majority leader and as somebody who counts the votes on bills, I can tell you that is the route we have to take, given the politics of housing here in Connecticut. So it's kind of an all the above type of issue that's driving the affordability crisis, but certainly our inability to allow for supply to meet demand and demand of all kinds of housing is really, I think, central to this affordability issue.
I also think it's that we have let this go on for so long that we're now in that tidal wave portion of things where it's like we allowed this to happen and this to, it's not just zoning, it's not just political will, it's not just that, we didn't maintain assets that we should have maintained, all of these things, permitting, you name it, it's all come together into this perfect storm of where we find ourselves. And the incremental change is really hard for people who are advocates, everyone in this room, because you see how bad it is. We see how bad it is, and yet we can only move, just to get single stair was a Herculean effort. That's, incredibly challenging.
So we're going to move right from the campaign trail into session. No rest for the weary, right? So as we look forward to the session, we're really eager to hear more of the policies that we can expect to hear focus on. So Rep. Rojas, together you and Senator Duff have convened the Majority Leaders Roundtable on affordable housing since July of 2023. So can you talk a little bit about what policy recommendations that came out of that roundtable we can expect to see championed in the upcoming session?
Yeah, it's hard to know. The group hasn't met in a while. Difficult to keep that group going, particularly in election years when everybody's busy, distracted, running all over the place, and we all have day jobs. So I think it's actually hard to know what we're going to. There are going to be bills on housing, some of which we have heard from before, some which will not be politically possible, and then some others that will continue to chip away at this issue. But it's hard to know, right? We need to know what's the legislature going to look like after 2025. I know, particularly for the House Democratic Caucus, we continue to pick up seats and have new colleagues who represent districts, which is a very political issue. And if you've read any of the articles over the last couple of weeks, there are a lot of my colleagues who are very, very public about local control and how sacrosanct it is and how important it is, and we can't do anything to change it. So that complicates the politics of how we handle it within the building and within the chamber, and trying to figure out exactly what we can get done. We will have some data back from the Fair Share study. We'll see what the reactions are to that. I think the big question in Fair Share is, what is the accountability measure? Because that is where we're getting hung up. I mean, I think some people were just ideologically opposed, period, to it, and couldn't even vote for a study, right, or vote to do the needs assessment, which I think speaks volumes about where we are politically. But figuring out what the accountability measure is, working with costs, working with CCM to see exactly whether they think they should be held accountable, because it doesn't seem that they should be. But I'll be certainly looking at additional funding for our councils of governments to try to provide some more technical and staff capacity at the COG level, knowing that many of our towns and cities just don't have the planning departments that allow for them to actually even consider proposals. Recently had a conversation with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection around getting a better handle on resources for sewer and water expansion, recognizing that there are political obstacles to achieving that too. So we have to go the incentive route, which is fine, but the incentive route is like a 10, 15, 20, or never type of solution to, I think, a lot of these issues. So it becomes a question, do we have the political will to actually do something more aggressive?
I was on the majority leaders roundtable. Obviously there are some bills that came out of planning and development last year that may have made it through the House, but did not necessarily make it through the Senate. The transit-oriented development bills, certainly I plan on going back at that, because as you can see, lots of opportunity there. And I continue to hear about how young people and seniors, it's amazing how we can actually find demographics that overlap. But yes, young people and seniors really would like to be close to transit so that they can, live better lives in that kind of housing. I also plan on bringing back the tiny shelter bill. I think it's really important that we continue to have that conversation around zoning. I think that it's been successful in New Haven, and I think that we should look to that as a model. It has been successful other places. I'm not quite as enthusiastic as making it also for higher institutions of education like they did in California, because I don't think we have that political will. I had someone who asked me to do it for all nonprofits. I don't think we have the political will for that either, but I will say that I've had churches and temples reach out to me since the bill did not pass. I think that's critically important because they're the ones that are going to have to move that bill forward. I also think that we are going to have to look at some sewer ideas, because that's what we hear over and over again. I think part of our job is eliminating these barriers that towns continue to say they have. It was why I put forth the housing growth menu last year, because the reality is towns need to be building, but if it doesn't work in Greenwich, but it works in Avon, or it works in Avon, but doesn't work in Hartford, we want to be, the kind of legislature, I think, that is empowering people to build so that we get it done faster, because we're not building fast enough. So if we're not empowering towns to do that, so yeah, unfortunately, it is a lot of incentives. It's way more carrot than stick, but I feel like the incentive should be, we're going to give this to you, but you are going to build. And I think that there are a lot of towns that would agree with that. I have town planners who reach out to me who have very different opinions than who represents them in the state legislature, who say to me, why aren't we taking advantage of building here so that people who are trying to work at, say, Electric Boat aren't driving all the way to Rhode Island to find housing? Some food for thought.
Barbara, as you said, it'll take 5, 10, 15 years. That's the reality of building, is it's a long game. But, we've invested billions in affordable housing development, and affordability has only gotten worse for so many families. So what key investments do you think need to happen this year to turn the tide?
Yeah, no, I think we certainly are not utilizing our public housing authorities in the most efficient and optimizing way. I don't know that we have given them the resources they need. They do have control land, they control buildings, they're locally governed, so check a lot of boxes on the politics of housing in Connecticut. But I know that there are some housing authorities that are also obstructed by their local government with being able to do anything. But certainly it begins with the resource question. How do we we have $900 million out there in bonding for all sorts of things. It's going to be great to go to developers and build some private housing. Some market rate housing, all well and good, with a couple of affordable units sprinkled in there. there. But why not give more resources to our public housing authorities and help them address a very real need, in particular for the segment of the population that I'm most concerned about, but the folks at the lowest end of the income spectrum, the 30% of AMI, the 50% of AMI, those are the folks I'm most concerned about, because it's clear we can build market rate housing and people are going to be okay with paying $2,500 in rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. It's crazy, but they'll do it. But how do we meet the needs of folks at that 93,000 number? Those are the people we're talking about, and those are the people that I'm most concerned with.
And I would add to that, all of that, and I think the conversation about the COGS and what the COGS can and cannot do, but using the COGS more effectively, and maybe that is with funding, and in order to make sure that they have town planners they can loan out, things like soil experts. I mean, you hear a lot from small towns. We don't have this person. We don't have that person. Okay, well, we also don't have county government. And people are shocked when we travel the country and they hear that we don't have county government, because some of that would have been absorbed there. I won't use the R word, just terrify everyone. But the great thing about the COGS is that they can regionally provide expertise that these small towns need if they are of the mind to want to build.
And the challenge with the COGS, of course, is that their governing bodies are made up of their chief elected officials. It used to be that it was more planners and those folks who were represented on their bodies. And I know that when they do get together and they do work, they tend to be more apolitical. It's less of a partisan divide when they are addressing issues. But let's be clear, there are some COGS that are less politically interested in doing anything around housing than others. And that'll be a challenge that we'll have to figure out how we overcome.
I really appreciate that you highlighted, the housing need for our lowest income neighbors, and the reality that we'd have to build at a scale that is far beyond what Connecticut's building at to really touch the folks who have the lowest income. So, when we started, we talked about it being a full spectrum of interventions. It's not just building, it's affordability, it's our voucher system, it's our tenant protections, that it's going to take all of those to really solve the housing needs of our state. But, today we're talking about supply. I think, polling, you guys hear about the polls all the time. Polling shows really strong public support for affordable housing reforms. And a poll conducted last year shows that 70% of Connecticut respondents support building more affordable housing in their community. And 61% believe that the state should intervene if local governments fail to act. But despite this, you and your colleagues have faced pretty significant barriers to passing legislation. So what do we do? How do we navigate past these? How do we overcome those roadblocks?
So this kind of goes back to the whole, we need to hear from people. It's great to have the choir in the room today, right? But the challenge is that in these difficult seats where maybe there is someone of one party who would like to be pro-housing, but they're being told if you go even a little bit pro-housing and pro-affordable housing, you're going to lose your seat. That is really scary, right? So I think that in the same way that we tell our environmental friends, hey, we need to hear from more people who are in the choir as opposed to only the people who are not in the choir, you have to get the word out better. I mean, that poll alone tells you the people we're not hearing from are the ones who support this the most. And I have to say, there's a lot of coalition building, and we spend a lot of time on this. I would give a shout out to Desegregate Connecticut for the coalition building that they engaged in over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years, in terms of doing audits in towns and having those conversations and making sure that they are having conversations with people who wouldn't ordinarily step up to support this out of the gate. And I think that's, you also have to, certainly I would say we've put ourselves out there on this issue. And I think that when legislators put themselves out there on this issue, it does draw other legislators to it. And I think that's the conversation we have to keep having. Honestly, this should not be a partisan issue. It's not partisan if you look at that poll, because I guarantee you 70% of who was polled, they are not one party. And so the coalition building is critically important, and I think we have to continue to do that in order to get there. But we also have to hear from the public who supports this, the 70%.
And I think part of it is breaking through, understanding what that means, because sometimes I wonder, as strong as a poll as that is, are those people saying, yeah, as long as it's in some other community, I support it? I don't know. I do happen to believe that there is a lot more support for pro-housing initiatives out there than we understand or than an individual legislator understands. And certainly we have more legislators who are stepping out from districts that are challenging. One is sitting right next to me. It's a bit easier for me to be, pro-housing, representing East Hartford and Manchester. But we do also have colleagues from Fairfield County who have been a lot more courageous about the positions they're taking on this. But it just takes a while to get there. But it's really, I'm beginning to turn it back on the people who, you need to make your voices more heard. And I've been challenging my colleagues too when they come up and say, oh, my district is against this. And I'm like, well, how many of them did you hear from? Did you poll them? Right? And even when you ask the question, how many you heard from, 6 or 7, right? That doesn't necessarily represent a overwhelming political tidal wave against you if you were to vote for something on pro-housing. But there are people who are very effective, and not to make this partisan, but my Republican colleagues do a very good job of weaponizing this politically, where they're able to say certain things. We're going to build high-rise apartments in your single-family neighborhood. I don't know that anybody's trying to do that. We're going to destroy the character of your community. I don't know that that's necessarily true. Our communities have been changing forever. So it's a really nuanced conversation that we have to have, but there are some real political realities at play here.
Just a reminder to folks, I think I've seen Kayla collecting questions. If you have one, I'm going to move to audience questions just after this next one. So we'll leave it in the air. So one way that we improve is often by looking at what our neighbors have tried and what their outcomes are, although Connecticut is usually in the lead on things, which sometimes is scary, right? We're like, wait, we're the forerunners on this?
Does it feel like we're in the lead?
But in other states, Charlie talked about large omnibus housing builds have been less successful. So while those smaller incremental targeted bills have passed, do you see Connecticut's overall legislative strategy around housing reform shifting in the upcoming session?
Yeah, we often resort to the large omnibus bill as a practical issue. We have time constraints. We can only debate so long. We don't have a filibuster, but we do have a kind of a practice of unlimited debate, and sometimes that works against us. So if we want to do 10 things on housing, well, we don't have time for 10 bills on housing, so we end up with the omnibus bills, but I know the omnibus bills end up scaring some people or making it more difficult for colleagues to vote for. If there's 90% of it is something they can vote for, but fair share is even referenced in it or mentioned it as a word, suddenly they can't vote for it, right? So there's certainly a downside to the omnibus approach to it, but certainly the individual one has its own limitations as well.
Yeah, I would say as chair of planning and development, as for instance, last short session, we got 41 bills out the door. Now, they weren't all related to housing, of course, or zoning, but you don't get 41 bills passed. It's hard enough to get things out of the House because that happens to be the committee. The way the cognizance works, it's a House committee, but then trying to get things out of the Senate is very challenging when you're up against that clock. The omnibus bill, honest to God, the word fair share doesn't even have to appear. It's just automatically a fair share bill, which has been demonized over and over and over again. But it is a reality. It's just that the conversation around it is like, oh, these big scary bills. Well, the elements typically in those big scary bills have all had public hearings. They've all had time for public comment. And yet we act like we just invented this out of whole cloth overnight. So I think that's, I would like to do slightly larger bills myself just because of the time factor. But sometimes it is harder to do those, both to execute them in committee and execute them in passage.
Great. I'm going to hand the mic over to my question collectors to pose a couple.
All right, so I got a handful of questions here. We'll see how much time we have to go through them.
Those are all softballs.
Yeah. Okay. 2 years ago, the state legislature passed a law making it a requirement for municipalities with a population of 25,000 or more to have fair rent commissions. Now that there are over 53 fair rent commissions coming online, what funding support might the legislature provide to these towns to continue to run their fair rent commissions?
I guess it raises the question, do they need funding support? At some point, there's always this question that, towns can never afford to do anything on their own. At some point, towns just need to do this because it's the right thing to do. I don't know that the state is in a position to subsidize every single action that towns should otherwise be doing. So one, I don't know if there are going to be resources to give towns. What exactly would that look like? But towns and cities operate dozens of commissions and task forces and this and that without a need for funding. I don't know why there would be one needed for this one, other than perhaps training, technical support to ensure that people who are participating on these things really understand what their role is and what the law is. But outside of that, what is it that they need funding for?
And is that somebody that could be loaned to them as opposed to funding individually? And I would just say, in addition, I would love to see the number go from 25,000 to 0, because I know that my towns aren't included in that, and that's a real problem.
Thank you. So a big part of rising housing affordability for many Connecticut renters is rising rents. Do you see a role at the legislature in helping to manage this and to help those extremely low-income households?
So obviously, this is one of the most challenging questions we get, because we have this conversation every single cycle. What should we do about rent capping? What should we do? I just had a landlord who sounds like they're doing all the right things. They're a family business. They're a 3-generation family business. It sounds like they've done everything they can not to, raise rents, but they get driven by the market too, the same way our housing prices get driven by the market. I hope we can find a solution to this. I think this is where we look to other states to see if they've been successful with this, how they've been successful with this, because this one seems to get hung up every single time at the end of session, and then we've gotten nowhere, even if it has a gajillion co-sponsors on it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I don't know if they were embedded in that was a question about rent caps, right? But I don't know that that's politically feasible in our legislature, and certainly landlords have gotten a lot more organized and active in the process, and I know they're getting the ear of legislators as well, and I don't know that we should be demonizing every single landlord out there, because many of them are kind of mom and pop operations, and I think we often think about large corporate operators when we hear landlord, and nobody has sympathy for them, but the reality is the vast majority of landlords are small businesses, so when you limit their ability to raise revenue, it limits their ability to reinvest it back into their property, so it becomes a question of what is the balance on that question? I mean, obviously, addressing the question of rents, more competition would help if we look at it from an economic perspective, if there were more supply. But here we are. It's a chicken or the egg type of thing.
And we recently just had a fire in Avon that was devastating and displaced over 50 families. And again, that was one of those landlords that there is an office in Hartford, but they really aren't based here. And, having to bring in the Attorney General's office just to get people moved and get the right funding within the town. I mean, that's not what we should be seeing. So to the extent that we can assist with that, we should be, because these corporate folks are not doing right by people.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions sort of on the other side. So there's that one side of housing affordability that is affecting households, renters, but then we also see rising housing development costs. So there's a couple of questions about, how might small developers like your local mom and pop landlords access government resources to help bridge the gap between the high cost to build and the lower rents that would be affordable to those 93,000 households in Connecticut that aren't finding an affordable place to live.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to understand, DOH is obviously working with a lot of developers. I don't know. I can't tell you if they're working with smaller ones, medium-sized ones, big ones. I think the assumption is that they're working with the larger operators. So it becomes a question of, are any of the existing funding streams available for us to segment a piece of that off to work with smaller scale developments, right? Somebody who wants to do a 4-unit middle housing type of development, right? I imagine that there's funding streams out there for them, but the cost of development in Connecticut is very expensive. We've heard often we can't control labor costs, lumber costs. Again, it's 5 L's. I forget what the L's are: labor, lumber, land, something the other, right? So all those things factor into this equation. So I don't know if it's just the funding stream to help an individual developer, or is it a matter of looking at all of those issues and really getting creative about how do we provide access to land? Is it public land, right? Is it going back to public housing authorities? But there are some things that we can control, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should do nothing.
And I will say that Department of Housing definitely does work with smaller organizations, and I know that because we were trying to put in a much larger development in Avon that was affordable, and at first they were even balking at looking at it. So I think that that's important to know, is that they're not just going, oh, if you're not building 100 units, we're not interested. That's not happening. So I think maybe they just don't have maybe you don't have the right connection. I would say work with a legislator. If it's not your legislator, you could always reach out to one of us. I think that any way that we can, again, move the needle, that's what we need to be doing. And come January, we'll be having, I'm going to help host an event with the home builders and the realtors, and we'll have this conversation in a little bit more depth.
All right, I think this will be our last question. So Connecticut has some urban main streets with ground floor retail, but vacant second and third floors. How might we be able to make upper story residential easier to bring back to our main streets to create additional density without zoning reform and without promoting new construction? So, if we're not able to accomplish those things at the legislature, zoning reform, what are other avenues that we might be able to pursue?
I don't know. Towns could address that issue right now on their own, but they choose not to. So I don't know if it's a question of the legislature making them do something, or perhaps you need some mayors to come up here and answer the questions that you're asking, because they all have the ability and the power to do something today and are choosing not to. And it seems the only people being held accountable are state legislators, when the onus really should be on our local leaders as well too.
And I would say, again, that plus, Canton for just to get mixed use in. I think it took them 14 years to get that into place. I think that towns and cities should be reaching out to the other towns and cities that have made this work, and to use them as examples. And, by all means, empower yourselves, because we need you. We need those units.
One more question. So I have one more question, but I'm going to write down.
People online might need the microphone.
Hi, I'm an elected Planning and Zoning Commission member in a wealthy suburb in Fairfield County. Elected in a town that, like many of our wealthy suburbs, was Republican for 100 to 150 years until 20 years ago, was purple 10 years, and now it's fully blue. We cannot lose re-election. Please don't quote me on that. I said it into a microphone. But we still feel, and this is really a question for what you see within the minds of your fellow state legislators in the Democratic majority in the House and the state Senate. I see two things in people's minds. One is that there's still a fear that we lose re-election, that the Republicans could take over our town or win election in our districts. And I see another issue, which is for some of our, let's say some of our elected officials whose roots in democratic policy go back into, say, the environmental movement in the 60s and the 70s, and have still a little bit of a zero population growth mindset, and they are essentially housing need deniers to some extent, and they look at the fact that, our state population, or our town, or our county population is relatively constant over the decades, and they completely ignore shrinking household sizes and how you can need more homes, even without more people, and also the pent-up demand for people who would move to the state and move to our towns if there were housing for them. So my question is this: in the state legislature, so kind of those two factors of fear of losing re-election and also a kind of dated mindset that doesn't really believe that more housing is a good thing. Do you see those two things? Do you see anything else? What is holding back the Democratic majority from just making change?
Oh, you had to do that.
I defer to my colleague, Eleni DeVraw.
I'm taking a moment and a pause so that my frustration with this doesn't entirely come out. As someone who did represent a more purple district, I lost my first election and won in 2020. I think that there is a misperception in some districts, not all districts, that yes, people think they're going to lose if they support any kind of housing and development and progress. Because when you go on Facebook to whatever town page you have, there's the same 10 people screaming about the same 10 things about development. And that is really hard when you're in an echo chamber and you get the 6 emails and you get 0 that say, you know what, I really would love to have a tiny shelter available in our town on our church's property, because I know for a fact that our homeless people go to a city instead of staying here where there are no resources. I also think that when you're talking about the environmental piece, we saw that this last session, and it was really hard to hear because that was not our intent with a specific bill that we were working on. But the reality is that there have been in towns, wetlands commissions and others who have used wetlands against progress and building, even when they weren't necessarily really wetlands. And so I think that part of this is an education for people, and part of it is you got to decide the hill you're willing to die on as an elected official. And for me, the hill I'm willing to die on is making sure that there's a roof over people's heads. And not all of my colleagues can say that because they can't for a variety of reasons, but that's, it's kind of hard. But education is helping. I have to say, I think I explained as of right more than I explained anything else last session, and I said it over and over and over and over anytime anybody gave me the chance to talk about it, because it's been made into a boogeyman, and it's not.
And the solution to that was suggested to me is we should just change as of right to something else, call it something else, as if that was what was going to solve the issue. But I was going to end with, it just comes down to political will. I think that's what answers your question. I certainly want my colleagues to return to the legislature. There are Democrats who might not be as good on housing issues, who are good on lots of issues, so it's not a zero-sum game here. But if we look at it kind of from a civil rights perspective, right, it's always taken political courage to actually do what the right thing is, and we have to start asking our colleagues, are you willing to do the politically courageous thing and do the right thing? Whether it's your number one issue or not, this is kind of the civil rights issue, one of the civil rights issues of our time, always has been, didn't end in 1968. Here we are today, but it comes down to that.
So we do have time for one more question. So
The character of many of the towns in the state of Connecticut that were asked to respect was based off the housing segregation of my grandparents and my parents. Why should I have to respect the character of a town that was built to keep me out?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from on that, right? I am also someone who values kind of the small town look and feel of communities across Connecticut. That doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be changes doing without preserving what I think a lot of people value about their community, right? Small town feel, beautiful little Main Street, little coffee shop here, but your point is well taken, right? I think that's a different discussion I think that we could have. I think we can continue and we should continue to challenge people morally on that question. But I've gotten to the point where I don't know that we can speak on moral grounds on this issue, unfortunately, right? I think we have to shift the conversation to one of economics, because I think that's what really can get people to change and think differently about this. That's why we're having the conversation today. Suddenly affordability is an issue and people care about housing when Connecticut has been as segregated as it's ever been for a very long time, but nobody was worried about that issue.
I'll start with the economic piece of this and then circle back. I think that you remember when we used to hear about that letter about GE leaving Connecticut, like over and over and over, every news article forever and ever was all about GE leaving Connecticut. What they would always leave out of that conversation was they mentioned housing and transportation in that letter, because it was just easier to say, it's the taxes. But the reality is that we have all these businesses that are trying to have employees here. And didn't Electric Boat end up having to build their own housing? Because, like back in the day, there were corporate towns, right? You had to build the actual housing in order to get your employees to be able to work, because otherwise you didn't have any employees. So I think this has become, and it's nice to see that the business community has really come along in a lot of ways with this conversation. I'm really grateful for that. But to the character question, it's really interesting to me, the towns that say that the loudest, that often don't have what I would consider to be any character left in that town. They're not exactly the Hallmark movie character, like they're not coming to us to say, oh, I want to film in your town because it's so quintessentially New England, Route 44. But I don't think you should, is the answer. I don't think that I don't think we should be using the word character. In fact, we basically legislated it out. And I think that character's in the eye of the beholder, and that's not, should we pick character over safety? Should we pick character over, making sure that people are housed and fed? I don't think so. But again, that gets us back to the moral will and, how we feel about budgets and everything else.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll call out my own town. I'm on those Facebook groups and I see the same 10 people yelling about the same things around development. But also the roundabout, I could spit on the roundabout.
Yeah.
It's not that bad. But also people are like, when will there be a Trader Joe's? So they want the amenities that they want and they want to close that out for everyone else. So
they'll complain that we're getting our 10th Italian restaurant, but at the same time, it's like, don't build over here. I mean, just to give just one example, there was a bridge that needed to be fixed, and so cool that when they actually went to fix it, they found this like Paleolithic it was just it was unbelievable the history that they uncovered while they were trying to put in this bridge. I didn't even know the bridge was controversial, if I'm being honest. Technically not my district, Tammy Exum, but the point being that it's this, I think it's beautiful. There's now river access. They set it up in such a way. There's even this gorgeous natural rock formation bench. I mean, there was real thought and planning put behind this, which I would say is character, except that you still have people screaming and yelling that, oh my God, how could you do that to the bridge? Which, by the way, if you didn't hit the right spot on that right after the bridge, the light wouldn't turn green, and you're sitting there trying to get to work, and then you got to get out of your car to go get the person in front to roll up so the light I mean, come on now. That's character? Come on. I'm just tired. So
I've sat at that light many.
You know what I mean.
But I think that's a great example too of when we can find the money and when we can find the will to make change and who matters and who we're willing to make those investments for and what we're willing to sacrifice our character for. We'll sacrifice it for Trader Joe's, but we won't sacrifice it so someone else can live in our community. I was recently at a town meeting and there was a discussion about, caring about our residents. And I asked everyone to raise their hand if they were born in that town, and no one did. So, right, we all become residents of our communities because there's housing opportunities available for us. And so this mindset of closing that door to only have opportunities for us is unfortunately prevalent. Thank you for bringing that into this conversation. So let's end with a focus on the future, right? So many potential options, so many potential reforms that Connecticut is exploring, could be exploring, looking at other states. What do you hope Connecticut's housing landscape will look like in the next 5 to 10 years if the state makes the right reforms now?
Ideally, and 5 to 10 is, because I think we're looking really more at 10 to 20, but ideally, it is not a death match to get a house. It is not that the rent is so high that, like the seniors in my district say to me, my rent went up $24 more when I was only expecting 50. It's now 74, and I can't go on the bus trips that the town provides because that was my bus trip money. My hope is that we have triplexes, duplexes, dare I dream, townhomes, so that it is a mixture, and that our character of our towns is now different because we've allowed all this housing to come in, and that means we've allowed people to come in.
Yeah, I guess my hope is that 90% of our land is not zoned for single family is one. My hope is that gosh, well, what are my hopes for 5 to 10 years from now? That we're maybe at 7,000 housing permits being pulled a year, or 8 as opposed to 5 or 6, I think would help us in addressing this question. I hope we're not talking about it in 5 to 10 years. I know chances are we will be, but perhaps with not as much lack of optimism, I won't say pessimism, but less optimism than we otherwise should have on this particular issue. But I mean, I think if we address the zoning question, which allows for more permits, I think we're in a much better place than we are today.
And I would say also taking away, I won't call them excuses, but reasons that people have. So that means, okay, you don't have sewer, we'll find money for sewer, we'll find money for whatever the infrastructure is, or whatever these barriers are that you keep throwing up until we all realize that some of them were really artificial in the first place.
Great. Thank you so much. A round of applause for our representatives. Now's a great time to run to the restroom or grab tea. Our next presenter is joining us virtually, so we're just going to need about 45 seconds to 3 minutes, depending on how tech savvy I am, to get that going. All right, as folks get back to their seats, I'm going to get us started so we can end right on time. I want to build on the momentum from Representative Rojas and Representative Cavros-DeGraw and turn our attention to the experiences of our neighboring state of Massachusetts. We are very fortunate to have Matt Noyes with us today, who will share more about the recent passage of the landmark Affordable Homes Act and offer us some valuable lessons as we continue to shape Connecticut's housing future. So I know some folks are still filling up their coffee, Matt. I think you can see the room a little bit here, but they can hear you. I think we'll check that in a second. So please join me in welcoming Matt Noyes, Director of Public Policy at CHAPA.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am hoping that I'm coming through clearly. Maybe not. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me well? Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. All right, great. There's just a little delay. First of all, thank you so much for allowing me to do this virtually. I was hoping to be there. Unfortunately, my preschool drop-off schedule did not allow me to do that in such a way. So happy to be joining you via Zoom. So as was mentioned, I am the Director of Public Policy at CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association up here in Massachusetts. For those of you not familiar, CHAPA is a grasstops organization based on a coalition model. We've been around for about 60 years now, coming out of the civil rights movement, believing that everyone deserves the right to have a safe, accessible, affordable home in the community that they choose. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the Affordable Homes Act, this landmark legislation that was passed up here in Massachusetts and signed into law this past August. And so speaking of technological challenges, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully that will go okay. Where's my slideshow? So hopefully that goes okay. Even if you can see my notes, that's okay because there's really not much on the notes side.
Good, Matt.
So the Affordable Homes Act is our bond bill legislation. This is legislation that the legislature passes every 5 years to give the governor authorization to issue bonds to provide capital financing for home development up here in Massachusetts. Our previous bond bill was scheduled to expire earlier this year, and so there was certainly a time crunch to get this done. We had a new governor starting last January. Governor Maura Healey came into office, and so she had a relatively short amount of time to get a bill together and file it, and then for the legislature to act, because the way the rhythm of our legislative session goes, the end of formal sessions is on July 31st of the even numbered years leading up to the election. So we can do informal sessions up to that, but a bill like the bond bill would require formal sessions to get done. So last October, almost exactly a year ago in Chelsea, just outside of Boston, Governor Healey announced the filing of the Affordable Homes Act. And you can see the folks lined up behind her, very serious looking group back there. And then you see, fast forward to this past August, a much happier crowd at the bond bill signing in Newton as this bill became law. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got from there to here, what's in the bill, and some of the advocacy lessons that maybe can be translatable to you all as you look to pass similar legislation. So first and foremost, what's in the bill? The most important element of the bond bill is the level of funding authorization that is included in it. Back in 2018, there was 1.8 billion in bond authorization, which at the time was the highest ever passed. When the dust settled on this legislation, the legislature approved 5.1 billion in bond authorization, a dramatic increase. Now, I always feel the need to sort of be a little bit of a wet blanket on this one. We all know what's happened with the development costs over the past several years. So 5.1 billion certainly does not buy as many homes as it would have back in 2018. Additionally, bond authorization does not mean that all of that money will go out the door. It's part of a larger capital budget that the state puts into play, including a lot of other bonds. And so it's usually about a third to a half of that total amount that ends up going out. Still, it's much better to have the authorization that high than it is to not have it. If we don't not authorized for it, it can't be spent. So it certainly recognizes the scope of the challenges that we have up here in Massachusetts around housing. So also included in the bill were tax credits. Now, typically when it comes to a bond bill, advocates and the legislature and the administration makes a push to have a clean bill, no policy, only bond authorization included in it. And that's not for any reason of opposition to those policies or to tax credits, but because anytime you start adding pieces onto a bond authorization bill, you run the risk of something controversial delaying it, and at the end of the day, not getting the bill passed, which would have a real devastating impact and a gap in funding rounds. This time around, the governor chose to go big on this, and it was a risky move, but it ended up paying off as we'll see. And she included other pieces in as well. So we had some state tax credits that were included. Community investment tax credit was increased from 12 million to 15 million. For the very first time, we had a home ownership production tax credit. This is brand new dollars. We had a state historic rehabilitation tax credit that was doubled, and the sunset was moved out from 2027 out to 2030. So these are really, really important development tools. So in addition to these development tools and the bond authorizations, the governor included more than 20 different policy proposals, and a lot of them ended up passing and included. These are some of the highlights that were included in the bill. And we think this is important because we know that the extent of our challenges are great enough that it's not enough to throw money at it. We need some policy, some systemic changes. So we have established for the first time in Massachusetts in statute an Office of Fair Housing and a Fair Housing Trust Fund to go with that to address some of the systemic challenges and systemic issues that we've had historically that have resulted in certain communities being locked out of the housing market. We have a statewide housing plan for the very first time. It's really striking to think of. We never had a mandate to develop a plan to know where we're going. So this is something that was included in the bill. So now that is in law that every 5 years the administration shall develop a statewide housing plan. Accessory dwelling units by right were included in this legislation. I know that was a point of discussion earlier this morning. Very proud to see that ADUs were included in there. ADUs are included by right now across the state in all single-family zoned areas. No parking restrictions if they are located within a half mile of public transit, a maximum of one parking space per unit. There is no owner occupancy requirement on it. There are some opportunities for communities to have a say over that, including site plan review. We're awaiting guidance from our executive office on that to see this will come into effect in February of this year. We have a supportive housing pool fund that was included in the bill that it provides resources for individuals and housing developments, individuals who have most recently experienced homelessness that require services in addition to their housing to maintain their housing. We have eviction record sealing in certain cases. So if a household has dealt with an eviction, it's not something that's going to stick with them for the rest of their lives. social housing pilot that was included, healthy homes program to provide funding for things like lead, mold, and asbestos remediation. We also have some commissions in here as well. Commissions sometimes are hard to get excited about, but these are short turnaround commissions that we're optimistic will result in some new policy ideas. So we have a commission on extremely low income housing, a commission on senior housing, and a commission on accessible housing. So we're really, really happy with what was included in the bill. This is not to say that we got everything that we hoped for in the bill or everything that the governor included in her version when it was initially filed. There was a provision that she included to enact a local option transfer fee where municipalities could assess a tax on real estate transactions above a certain amount and have the proceeds from that be used for local affordable housing development. That came under fire by certain elements within the business community and also from the real estate community. And in the end, although we were optimistic, it was not included in the final version of the bill that was passed. Governor also included a zoning reform to have municipalities implement inclusionary zoning by simple majority. We were hopeful on that. In the end, that was not included in the final version of the bill. Still, we want to focus on the positive, all the great things that we got in there. There's no such thing as a perfect piece of legislation, but we got a lot in there, and we think that's really important to celebrate for sure. So in terms of lessons learned from this advocacy-wise and the reasons why we were successful in getting this done, I think first and foremost, we have to talk about the governor's administration and the commitment to housing. From day one of coming into office, the governor indicated that housing and climate change were going to be her top two priorities, and she has stuck to that. She created in one of her first actions a secretariat level office, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Our housing agency used to live under Economic Development Office. And so for the first time now, we have a Secretary of Housing focused on that, on a cabinet level position. In addition, when she filed the bill, she didn't wait for the legislature to begin action on this. She started through executive order a number of actions, including the process of developing a statewide housing plan. So that began right in October as the administration fanned out and started engaging with communities in anticipation of this being law. So she really, really pushed this forward from the very beginning. Administrative advocacy supporting this. So I mentioned that we had, for the very first time, a housing secretary. When the bill was passed, this was almost like a nonprofit advocacy campaign with how the executive office acted. The secretary was out, and I don't know how many hundreds of cities and towns he was in across the state, but it felt like he was constantly on the road, engaging with folks, engaging with local legislators, touring housing developments, seeing what was out there, and really working to support this bill. In addition, the HLC created their own kind of stakeholder group to advocate for this bill. And it wasn't just the typical usual suspects around this. It wasn't just the CHAPs of the world, the homeless advocates of the world working on this. It wasn't just the development community as well. The administration engaged with the business community in a way on housing that they never have before, which is so important. We have seen within our business community, businesses recognizing that housing is one of their biggest challenges to success in Massachusetts. They are losing out on employees. So by engaging them in this, it's new voices coming into the housing advocacy world. And also the administration was really open to changes in the bill. There was a lot of pride in authorship of the bill. They were very proud of what they passed. Our HLC secretary is a former state senator, former municipal official as well. And he recognizes the need for evolution and change during the process. So they were very open to changes in the bill. It wasn't their way or the highway. They took good ideas, and there were improvements made in the bill at each level. They proposed about $5.5 billion. The legislature upped the stakes on it, and where we ended up is over $5 billion in authorization in there. So that openness to working with the legislature was so important, especially for a new administration, and that I think really garnered a lot of goodwill in the legislature. The legislature also really prioritized this bill. I mentioned that at the end, that our formal sessions end at the end of July. There were a lot of big bills still waiting for action on that very last day. The housing bond bill was one of the few bills that actually made it across the finish line, and they certainly had to do it, but there was a real chance that it could have been left into the informal session, and in which case probably the policy pieces and the tax credit pieces would have gotten stripped out, because during our informal sessions, you need unanimous consent to move legislation, and there's a very good chance that the policy pieces would not have cleared that high bar. So the legislature really, really put their money where their mouth was in this, and really put that to the top of the list. I heard over and over again from legislators a recognition of the importance of housing. I was in several meetings where state senators, state reps stood up and said, you know, when I talk to my constituents, the top 3 issues that I hear for importance from folks in my district are housing, housing, and housing. They knew that they had to do something. It's also important to note when the bill came across the finish line, it was notable what was not in the bill. We have a law up here, 40B, which is our affordable housing law that allows communities that have not built a certain percentage of affordable housing in their communities. Developers can bypass local zoning laws to build that housing. It's always under fire by local communities. And there were attempts during the legislation by some legislators to file amendments to weaken our affordable housing law. Those were all overwhelmingly shot down. People spoke out vehemently in opposition to them. We also have a fairly new law called our MBTA Communities Act that requires communities, mainly in the eastern part of the state, around our rapid transit system and our commuter rail system, to develop high-density multifamily zones in there that, again, municipal requirement. There's been some pushback on that. We have a lot of towns in compliance, but there was still some attempts to weaken and roll back MBTA communities, again, rejected overwhelmingly by the legislature. So this bill was only progress forward. We did not take, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. These were all steps forward in here. There was nothing in there, nothing in this bill at the end that made me cringe and said, oh man, we're really gonna have to work our way through that. So that's on the government side. On the kind of non-governmental housing stakeholder side, we have a very strong community of nonprofits and advocates across the map on this that all have very strong relationships with the legislature. So the ideas that we saw in the bill that was filed by the governor and that were advanced by the legislature were ideas that we've been advocating on for a long time. So there was already a socialization of those ideas and pre-existing support within the housing stakeholder community, which was really, really important. These were well-vetted policies. There's a lot of community coordination on this bill. This is a big bill, well over 100 pages, lots of different priorities in there, lots of very detailed policies. We had a very good coordination effort among stakeholders of communication and talking about this, who's gonna push what, who's got what legislator is going to offer an amendment, what changes are you pushing, what are the new things in there that people are hoping to get in there, how are we going to work this through? And I think legislators really appreciated that level of coordination. There were 2 public hearings on this bill. In January, the Housing Committee held a hearing. It was over 11 hours, just under 12 hours long, all throughout the day, of people getting up there to testify about the importance of housing, the elements of the bill. And I don't know exactly how the time breakdown was in terms of people speaking positively about the elements of the bill versus the very small number of people who had concerns about specific items, but it was overwhelming. There was really a recognition among the community about needing to speak about needing this bill. And one thing I'm very proud about, I think those of us who have sat through public hearings, there's always the danger that you just get hour after hour of people saying the exact same thing up there. We did manage to avoid that. We really were able to coordinate the conversation. We didn't have dozens of panels speaking on the same thing. we spread it out over the course of the bill. I think legislators appreciated that. It was a productive hearing in that way. So I'm going to end my screen share right now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have. Where's my stop share button? And it's limited what I can see in the room, so I will count on whoever to pass the mic around, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have about the Affordable Homes Act or the process of getting it done.
I just want to check that you can hear us.
I can, yes.
All right. I think there's a little bit of a delay, and we solved some of our wonky connection there.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'm happy to make the slides available if that's helpful.
Yes, that was on our end. So I failed to suggest that people write on cards, so we're going to go rogue and use the mic with folks, but I'll kick off a question because you were so positive, and I'm an advocate. I have to say, what were the compromises that happened behind the scenes though, right? Like it sounds, I'm here salivating listening to you, and I think other advocates are. Everybody came together, they all agreed. What were some of those key compromises that you were able to work out behind the scenes so that the bill could move forward?
So one of them was around ADUs. There was some pushback in certain communities, certain small areas of certain communities about the fear of what legalizing ADUs would mean. In a very smart maneuver by our House Housing Committee chair, he reached a compromise that we were all okay when saying basically the first ADU it can be allowed by right in those single family zones, but any more than that has to be a special permit. You know, we can certainly live with that if that's the level of compromise we have to do. So somebody's not going to build, 5, 6 ADUs. I don't think that's going to affect that many people. Certainly a compromise we could live with. We fought hard on the local option transfer fee. We were really hopeful about that because we need these resources to come in. We had a lot of positive indications at the beginning. Unfortunately, we lost on that. The real estate community in particular activated their networks, spent a lot of money on it. We had robocalls going out direct with what we would consider misinformation about the nature of what the transfer fee would do. And legislators and the speaker heard from that. 6 weeks before the House took up the Affordable Homes Act, the speaker made a statement at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, which is not exactly a friendly audience to something for taxes. And the speaker said there that we're going to do something on transfer fee and we're going to pass it. 6 weeks later, it was not included in the final version of the bill. So we did lose on that one. We will continue to push on it. So it didn't get everything in there, but did get a lot. There were some minor compromises that took place, but essentially the bill came through intact. And if anything else, it was kind of plussed up. One element that was kind of a compromise on is, legislators love to earmark bills and direct money at their own districts. That gets tricky when it comes to a bond bill because with bond authorizations and a process of determining which projects go forward, legislators included a lot of earmarks through amendments. What the legislature ended up doing was taking all of the earmarks, lumping them into one giant line item instead of dividing up existing bond programs. So that was a nice way to not hamstring the process of getting money out on the implementation end.
So hugely impressive. Questions in the audience?
Hey, Matt. Great to have you here. My name is Pete Harrison with Desegregated Connecticut. We work very closely with Fund Housing Massachusetts, and we're excited about the ADU bill. My question is actually about the MBTA communities bill. We had 3 years ago based our initial TOC development bill really around what you guys have done on the mandate side, right, in the total brick wall, and we've sort of gone a different direction. But the 2 questions I have for you specifically, which are relevant for us. One is now that there's compliance schedules happening, a lot of towns are, some are not. The AG is getting involved. We're curious what enforcement mechanisms exist in the bill and how it's actually working out practically. Is it the AG using existing civil rights laws and specific law in the statute itself that gave some more oversight? And then the second question is what resources, whether through you guys or some other state agency, have been deploying for towns to help them actually do the mechanical zoning or infrastructure upkeep? So those 2 questions I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So in terms of compliance right now, we have to date, I believe there are 78 communities who are in compliance right now and 2 that are out of compliance. One of those is a subject of active litigation by the state, as our Attorney General has sued them. They're arguing that the Attorney General does not actually have authority to enforce the law. It was argued in front of our Supreme Judicial Court about 2 weeks ago now, so we're waiting for the results of that. There is, by language in there, towns that are out of compliance are not eligible to receive certain grant funds. And the Attorney General wants to go further with that, obviously, to compel compliance. We're also providing, here at CHAPA and through the Executive Office, technical assistance for communities to develop their maps. We have a municipal engagement initiative that's working on the ground with planners, and other nonprofits are out there doing that. So we recognize that this is, a technical and difficult thing to adjust zoning in this way. And we're really happy with the number of towns that have reached compliance. We're expecting a number of other towns to come into compliance by the end of this year. The last year, by December 31st, the towns that were in the rapid transit communities, really in and around Boston near our subway system, they had to come into compliance. All but one did. Right now, we're in the commuter rail communities that have to come in compliance by the end of this year. So that's a lot of them. We think most of them are going to cross the finish line. Some of those are through city council actions. A lot of them are through town meetings. We are still in, the New England towns of open town meeting. So going through that process, my town will be doing that soon in the next couple months. So we'll get through that process as well. But we're looking a lot to what happens with the SJC and are optimistic about what will happen there. To be clear, though, the SJC case will not overturn the law, even if it goes in the other way. It has to do with enforcement, might require our executive office to come back out and come out with formal regs instead of guidelines on it. It gets very technical in nature. So communities will still have to come into compliance one way or another. The law is not in danger at this point of being overturned.
Unless there's one more burning question, we'll thank Matt for all of your time, and we know where to find you. A round of applause for Matt.
Thank you all so much. Hope to make it in person next time.
Thanks, Matt. As we come to a close, I want to take a moment and reflect. We've heard a lot about the challenges and the opportunities here in Connecticut. We've had a chance to zoom out and look at what's happening in some of our neighboring states, and thanks to Charlie, across the country. And, the thing that stands out for me is that while every state is super unique, the common thread is really that urgency to push through barriers. I think Massachusetts is a great example of having all of the ingredients, but really taking that political will to push things forward, and the bravery that it took from the advocates and the legislators to really take a stand, and the governor to take a stand and move things forward. So today's discussion hopefully reminds us that progress is possible, but that will require that persistence and the collaboration and the willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths about how housing policy has shaped Connecticut. To date, our disinvestment in Black and Brown communities, our exclusion from housing opportunities, our segregation. And as we leave today, I hope that you can carry some of these insights into your continued work, because what we've heard again and again is that it's going to take us coming together to move things forward. So I really appreciate all of you taking your time this morning to join us here. You can, let's see if I can advance this. All right. A reminder to join us. You can register now on our website for the conference. It's fully virtual, so you can do it from the comfort of your desk, and head back here for the reception. And please look out for a save the date for our final IForum of the year, Voices from the Land, the State of Housing Among Connecticut's Tribal Nations. We're firming up a date for mid-December, so you'll see that announcement come out soon. Thank you so much for your time today. A round of applause for all of you. And we'll look forward to seeing you back here soon.